snowing in Austin a little earlier today, so they didn't know what kind of an omen that was. I want to continue the political discussion now for just a moment. Bring in Mark Halperin, our political director. Mark, you've been listening to the legal discussion. Begin to meld it with the politics.
It's a very confusing time. Obviously, this story has gone on for weeks now. Here we are at a very strange time in what people in politics and media call the news cycle, right before local news here in the East. A lot of people are going to be getting their first words of this decision as they watch local news at 11 o'clock Eastern. And obviously overnight, they're going to want to digest this opinion. As Terry Moran said, the Gore campaign sees a muddled decision to some extent, and they're going to be reading every one of these pages looking for hope. As Dean said, the Bush campaign a slightly easier position. Clearly the decision is largely in their favor, and they're going to wait and react and see how does Al Gore react. The intention was, according to most of his aides, to, if it went against him, to get out of this in the same news cycle in that same day. Because it's so late now, it's really unclear what they'll do.
Mark, let me also ask you a question about the Florida legislature. It's controlled in the House and in the Senate by the Republicans. What might, based on what you've been listening to, be its disposition if the Florida Supreme Court comes along and orders it to do something different than it did today with its electors?
Well, I think we're several steps away from that, Peter, because they may continue if there's any indecision, and as our colleagues have said, the ball is really now seemingly in the court of the Florida Supreme Court. The legislature has always been there, controlled by Republicans, to select a separate group of electors to protect Governor Bush's position with the United States Congress. But again, I think that's probably going to have to wait to see how the Florida Supreme Court reacts and how Al Gore reacts. He may read this decision and decide going forward isn't the right thing to do.
Okay, hang on if you would, please, as well, Mark. To Sam Donaldson in Washington. Sam, on this sort of political wave which you can see begin to break on the shore in different ways now.
Well, Peter, if we're right, and this, in fact, makes George W. Bush the president, there's going to be a great deal of bitterness in this country by Democrats, perhaps by some others. It's not so much that the high court has made the decision. It's that it's made it by this narrow 5-4 split with the conservatives who stopped the counting on Saturday and now say, well, there isn't enough time, even if you devised a method of counting it constitutionally. There's talk in this town, Peter, that Justice O'Connor and Chief Justice Rehnquist want to retire. But the talk is they wanted to wait to make certain there was a Republican president. That may not be fair to them. But this kind of talk adds poison to the atmosphere. I think this decision will not be, it'll be accepted, it has to be accepted, it's the high court. It will not be accepted with any sort of feeling that the court has rendered a just and fair verdict.
Okay, Sam, thanks very much. Just to review that we're going to go on with this and try to get even further clarity in the next few minutes. But a U.S. Supreme Court, as divided as the nation is in many ways, certainly referring to what Sam talked about, the political divisions in the country, at least according to the Associated Press, who've been poring over this as we have, has ruled for George W. Bush, reversing the state court decision that had ordered the new recounts for Mr. Gore. The justices said the recount, according to the AP, ordered by the Florida Supreme Court violated the Equal Rights Amendments, or provisions of the 14th Amendment, which we've already decided on, and there was not enough time to conduct a new effort that would meet constitutional muster. Stephen Guy, I apologize, in Tallahassee, there's something I just don't understand. This continues to strike me, a layman, a little bit, as if it's the Supreme Court wanting to get this decision out of its hands or back to the Florida State Supreme Court so that the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't have to take the fall for it. Is that a foolish thought?
Well, no, it's not a foolish thought. It's, although this is the way it typically is done. In other words, when the U.S. Supreme Court makes a decision, it doesn't actually enter the final decree. What it does is it sends the case back down to the court from which it received it initially, because the Supreme Court only has appellate jurisdiction. And the court that it then receives it back is the court that actually enters the final judgment. But, you know, to just reiterate what Jack and Ellen have already said, in reading this thing through now twice, I don't think the Florida Supreme Court has much discretion here. I think there are two basic holdings. One is that any recount done prior to December 12th is unconstitutional. And two, the December 12th date is sacrosanct, and under Florida law it has to be respected. The Florida Supreme Court just doesn't have any discretion anymore.
And it is the state legislature in Florida which decides that the December 12th date is sacrosanct, even though it's been argued very vigorously for a week or so that there is still time to do something.
Well, the problem is the Florida Supreme Court's own opinion, which said that it recognized that the Florida legislature had already made that policy decision to respect the December 12th date. And having said that, it's going to be hard for the Florida Supreme Court really to go back on that.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. To Jackie Judd at the Supreme Court.
Right, Peter. I was just going through Justice Souter's dissenting opinion,
Mark.
and we've been talking, of course, about this, my words, not the court's, but a kind of empty gesture on the part of the U.S. Supreme Court to say, we reverse the order and we send it back to you, but there's really no time for you to do anything. And Justice Souter addressed this in his dissent. He said, first of all, unlike the majority, I see no reason for this court to assume that Florida could not possibly comply with the requirement. And he sees the important date here as being December 18th, not the 12th. And then he goes on a little later, and in here I feel like there's a little trace of bitterness to what the court had done last weekend, and that is issue the stay, freeze the recount that was underway. He said to recount these manually would be a tall order, but before this court stayed the effort to do that, the courts of Florida were ready to do their best to get that job done. There is no justification for denying the state the opportunity to try to count all the disputed ballots now. So interesting words from David Souter.
Very resigned almost to an inevitability that the time has been eaten up, as so many people in every walk of life have been saying, that it was being eaten up time after time. So, George, one could argue, if you were very cynical about this, that Mr. Bush, or the Bush campaign, has accomplished its goal of eating up the time.
Now, of course, the majority in the court also had serious concerns about the way Florida conducted the ballot. But what I think you see there is probably an indication of how Vice President Gore might react to this. He might bow to the reality of the Supreme Court decision. He might say, listen, there's nothing I can do, the clock has run out, but agree with Justice Stevens in his dissent when he says that the majority has been disenfranchised. They have not had their votes counted. You would see a reaction from Vice President Gore saying, I disagree with the decision of the Supreme Court, but I will abide by it, a kind of withdrawing from the race without conceding that George W. Bush actually won.
You've been around politics a long time. Listening to some of the talk shows earlier today in anticipation of all this, a little hard to decide at which level the bitterness sets in or does not set in the country come a decision like this.
Well, and I think you have to distinguish between the country and the political elite. Right. I mean, there's going to be an awful lot of upset, I think, among the political elite, among the partisans very close to Vice President Gore over the decision of the Supreme Court effectively ending the election. The Supreme Court comes into this decision with great confidence in the country. About 66% of the country thought they would make a fair choice. It's going to be interesting to watch in the coming days to see if that number changes. People believe that the Supreme Court actually acted above politics or actually descended into the political thicket of politics that Justice Frankfurter warned them against.
I did hear a political veteran, a veteran of the Supreme Court, observer corps today, the Supreme Court take an awful lot of heat, retreat somewhat into itself, and that's taken heat before, and we'll get past this as well.
Very likely there have been close decisions in the past that the country has come to accept. Roe v. Wade was a very close decision. On the big decisions, though, in the past that have gotten the most acceptance, you've seen 9-0 decisions. Another political point, perhaps this was a failure, and maybe it was just irreconcilable, perhaps this was a failure of the political skills of Chief Justice Rehnquist because he could not construct a broader majority.
But let me go back to Ellen Davis at the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice is a man who very much apparently believes in having unanimity on the court whenever he can get it, and has a reputation of working quite effectively for it. Is this to be taken as a failure for him?
I think it is a failure for him to some extent, Peter. I think that certainly he's not inured to all of the publicity that has been attendant to this whole drama as it's unfolded, and the court really came under criticism for the order that it issued on Saturday and was accused of being political. And I think probably one of the reasons they labored so late into the night on this was because they were trying to arrive at some kind of a consensus, and clearly this looks like a political decision. And also, Peter, I just wanted to add, to underscore the point that you made about how it looks like they're just sort of sending this back to the Florida Supreme Court and saying, you know, it's your problem, you deal with it. There's a line in the per curiam opinion, the majority opinion without an author, where the observation is made that Justice Breyer's proposed remedy, which was sending the case back to the Florida Supreme Court and ordering a constitutionally proper contest until December 18th, is not acceptable. It's not acceptable. Why? Because of the December 12th deadline that is part of this statute that we keep talking about. And so basically what they're saying is we're going to send this back, and you can basically do what you want to do to make this constitutional, but there's no way we're going to allow you to do it in time for any contest, any recount that would be the result of that process to be constitutional, to be acceptable.
Thanks, Ellen. Ellen Davis at the Supreme Court. I want to go to our political director, Mark Halperin. Mark, all day